All right, Jabba, say good morning. Let us begin. In Chodesh, begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar Aleph, to thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Samuel Pollack, Zechariah Ben Zechariah Zichron Livracha, and Annie Pollack, Dinah Bas Rabdov Zichron Livracha. We thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar Aleph, Art and Sherry Miller, for dedicating all the Shiurim and Drushos this month in loving memory of Art's brother, Richard Miller, Reuven Ben Betzalel V'Rachel Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family a Nechama. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Gobbie Shayna Cohn, for dedicating the Week of Learning, commemoration of the yahrzeit of Shayna's father, Avi Strimber, Avraham Ben Kalman Eliezer HaLevi Zechariah Livracha. We hope that on the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an Aliyah and the family in Nechama. We thank all of our sponsors for their dedication and for their generosity. We welcome our new Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar Aleph. And above that, let us begin. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. A lot to do today. Today's daf is Chaf Aleph 21. We are picking up on Chaf Amud Beis, a little bit in the middle of Amud Beis. I will say, if you see Tosas Va'achoso, just go across into the Gemara and about 4 lines down from there. I'm embarrassed to say the number of lines up from the bottom. I'm going to use that as the marker. Excellent. Says the Gemara, Tan Rabbanan, Kala Ora Parshas Kohanim, Shekai Mitami Lohen, Aval Misaval Alehem. So I'll say the Brisa says as follows. Anyone is actually an interesting connection here. Anyone for whom a Kohen is obligated to become Tameh is someone for who you sit Shiva for. Right? Interesting idea. Remember again, a Kohen is not permitted to become Tameh, is not permitted to become exposed to Tumas Meis. So the Gemara says anyone for whom a Kohen is permitted to become Tameh for, which is a mother, father, brother, sister is an interesting one which we'll discuss, but we'll talk about sister, son, daughter, spouse. Any person who Kohen becomes Tameh for ultimately is who a person sits Shiva for. The Elohein, Ishto, wife, Aviv, V'imo, father, mother, Achiv, V'achoso, brother, sister, Bino, Ubito. Ultimately, son and daughter. V'osifu alein. Now, that's a Kohen. Now, in the laws of Shiva, laws of Avilos, Chazal added on a few more relatives. Hosifu alein, Achiv, V'achoso. They added on over here his brother and his mother. Achiv Achoso, his brother and his sister. Achiv Achoso Habasulo Mi'imo. So they added on over here a maternal, meaning for the halachos of Avelos, a maternal brother and sister. Vachoso Nisua, or a married sister. Bein Me'aviv, Bein Me'imo. Either from his father or from his mother. So both say, so that's the halachos. So again, to a certain degree, the Gemara is highlighting over here is, although the halachos of Tumah by a Kohen kind of serve as the foundation for whom you sit Shiva for, Chazal did add on a couple of more relatives as well. So for Shiva purposes, any brother, any sister, whether it's a maternal brother, a maternal sister, a married sister, all of these are relatives for whom one will sit Shiva. So the Gemara adds on, said Rabbi Akiva adds on, and the same way that you sit Shiva for these individuals, kach mis'abel al shniyim shalahem. So too, you will go ahead and mourn for secondary relatives. Now I will say, what's a secondary relative? What's shniyim? If you take a quick look at Rashi, Rashi says al shniyim shalahem, avi aviv, va'al ben beno, Va'al ben bito, va'al ben achoso. So I will say the same way, for example, that you go ahead and one would mourn for their father, one would also mourn for their father's father. The same way that one would mourn for their son, one would also mourn for their son's son. The concept of shniyim that Rabbi Akiva is introducing is something quite fascinating, which is anyone who you mourn for, if that person is in Avelus, you observe mourning as well. Which I will say is a very dramatic extension of the Avelus web. Rabbi Shimon Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Shimon Eliezer agrees with the principle that there is a concept of Avelus for Shniyim, for secondary relatives, but ultimately, again, he limits it to Ela al ben beno va'al aviv aviv. It only applies to the son of your son and to the father of your father. In other words, the concept of Shniyim really only applies in a very specific, limited fashion. The Chum say no. Kol shemisabel alav misabel imo. Chum say no. Both say Chum seem to agree with Rabbi Akiva, namely, whoever you mourn for, if that person is in mourning, you're in mourning as well. Which I will say just means, right? A person sits Shiva, mother, father, brother, sister, son, daughter, spouse. If any of those people themselves have then lost an immediate relative, who's not my immediate relative, they're sitting Shiva, I would observe Avelos as well. The Gemara just says, by the way, the Gemara says, Hainu Tanakama, aren't the Chachamim saying the same thing as Rabbi Akiva, the Tanakama? To which the Gemara says, no, Ika Benaihu Babayis. The boss says, interesting nafkamina. The nafkamina is as follows. That halacha l'maisa is the obligation to sit Shiva, or to mourn, I should say, for Shniim, only when you are in the presence of the direct mourner, or even when you're not in the presence of the direct mourner. Rashi says over here, Imo babayis etanakama lo bai shehei aviv o ben beno imo. Rabbi Akiva holds that halacha l'maisa, even if you're not in the presence of the direct mourner, you would still be observing mourning. Whereas the Chacham say, no, it's only when you're in their presence that you observe mourning practices. Both say the Gemara gives examples of this. And I will say, I just want to point out, this is a halacha that is accepted in the Gemara. The concept of shniim, the concept of anyone who you're obligated to mourn for, if that person is now in avelos for one of their immediate relatives, who's not my immediate relative, right? My father's father, right? My father is in avelos for his father. Chas v'sholom, my son is in avelos for his son. Those are called shniim, right? My mother is in avelos for her mother. Anytime someone who is my direct relative is in avelos for their direct relative, I am obligated in mourning practices as well when I am in their presence. So the Gemara says, Ki hada amar li Rabbi Chia, Rav l'Chia berei. Rav said to Chia his son. V'chein amar li Rav Huna l'Rabba berei. Rav Huna also said to Rabba his son, Bi'apa nahog avelusa. When your wife is in avelus, when your wife is mourning, when you are in her presence, you must observe mourning practices as well. Below apa, when you're not in her presence, lo tinhag avilusa, you need not conduct yourself with mourning practices. Mar ukva shachav le bar chamua. Mar Ukva will say, Mar Ukva's father-in-law lost his son, which means Mar Ukva's brother-in-law passed away. Right? Mar Ukva's brother-in-law passed away. Mar Ukva was ready to sit Shiva and Shloshim for his brother-in-law, because it was saying now Mar Ukva took a very expanded role of this. Remember again, Mar Ukva now, so essentially, Mar Ukva's wife lost her brother. So now, Mar Ukva's wife is going to sit Shiva and Shloshim. So ultimately, Mar Ukva assumed that he's also going to sit Shiva and Shloshim. Al Rav Huna, first wide line, Chafam days. Al Rav Huna legabe. Rav Huna went to visit him. Ashkechei, and he found, this is a pretty interesting story. He sees Rav Mar Ukva is sitting Shiva for his brother-in-law. So Rav Huna says to him, Amar lei, Sudenaisa bayis laneichal. Do you like Shiva trays so much that you've decided to go? We'll say, isn't this great? Right, great line, right? You like Shiva trays so much, you like the free food so much that you've decided to sit Shiva. Lo amru ela lechavod ishto ela chama v'chamoso. This halacha regarding one's wife, that if one's wife is in Shiva, one has to go ahead and observe mourning practices out of deference to her. It was only said when? Her parents, but does not apply to any other siblings. Great line. So the Gemara says as follows: L'sanya, misha meis chamavo chamoso. If someone's father-in-law or mother-in-law passed away, eno rashai lakov es ishto. A man should therefore not compel his wife lios kocheles, lios pokesas, to go ahead and apply any type of makeup. Ela kofe mitasa v'noin ima iva avelos. In other words, I will say, when one's wife is in mourning, one has to respect her mourning practices. What should a husband do? He should overturn his bed with her, which is another way of saying that he should observe mourning practices with her. Again, I will say, the Gemara is coming from the vantage point, if my wife is in mourning, I'm only obligated to mourn with her in her presence, right? Not in her presence, I'm not obligated. But Lamaisa, number one, the Gemara says, you can't compel her to kind of do activities of daily living. Pokeses, kocheles, make herself up, make herself look. She's sitting in Avelus. Not only that, I have to observe the morning practices along with her. Similarly again, a wife, if her mother-in-law or father-in-law passed away, She should not go ahead and adorn herself to make herself look all beautiful when her husband is in Avelus. Rather, she overturns her bed and she observes Avelus along with her husband. Incredible. Another brayso. Even though when a wife is mourning, a husband can't compel her to put on makeup. Be'emes amru. Nevertheless, Chazal said, Mozeges lo asakos, even when a wife is in mourning, she could still pour her husband a cup of wine. Matzas lo mita, she can make his bed. Umarchetzes lo panav yadav v'raglav, and she can still wash his hands and feet. Because who doesn't need that on a daily basis, right? And she can still wash his hands and feet. So the Gemara says, so kashina adadi, but it contradicts each other, right? Because the first brayso said that when the wife is in avelus, she doesn't do any of these things. The brayso now says, although she's not going to put on makeup, she's still going to do these other things for her husband. It depends on who she's sitting shiva for, right? In other words, we're more machmir when she's sitting shiva for her parents. There's more of a license for her to do things when she is sitting shiva for other relatives. So the Gemara says, Shema mina, tayam mihachi, the amru l'chod ishto elachama v'chamosa bilvad. Furthermore, again, I will say, the halacha is the only time that a husband is obligated to go ahead and observe mourning practices in the presence of his wife who is mourning is when she is mourning for who? When she is mourning for her mother or her father. So I will say, the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara will say, so before we go on, so we'll say, isn't this fascinating? That the Gemara, if you notice, by the way, there's no real machlokes over here. The Gemara is accepting the premise that when someone whom you are obligated to mourn for is now in Avelus, I am obligated, the non-mourning relative of the person who is currently in Avelus. So again, my wife is sitting shiva for a relative. I'm obligated to observe mourning practices in her presence, at least for sure for her mother and her father, right? My child, chas v'shalom, is sitting obligated, right? My parent, obligated. So we'll say, so first I want to point out, the Shulchan Aruch paskins this way halacha l'maisa. Shulchan Aruch adapts this halacha, that again, when someone for whom you are obligated to mourn, themselves is in Avelus, you are obligated to conduct yourself with mourning practices in their presence. That's the mechaber. Comes along the Ramah, and the Ramah says, presently we are megil. Why? Because they will say, what drives this halacha? What drives this halacha is covered for the avel. Covered for the avel. So if a relative of mine, a direct relative of mine, is sitting shiva, it's covered to go ahead and observe mourning in their presence. Right? So my wife is sitting shiva, chas v'shalom, it makes sense that as covered to my wife, I'm going to observe certain mourning practices in her presence. The Ramah says today, the avel is mochel on that covered. The avel is mochel on that covered. There is almost like an institutionalized or assumed level of mechila. And therefore, again, at least by Ashkenazim, I don't know what Sfardim do, because the mechaber does paskin this way. And the mechaber does not give any qualification for this. But at least by Ashkenazim, the Ramah, we assume the avel is not mevater. Mochel, sorry. The avel is mochel. The avel forgives this covet, and that's why, again, contemporarily, you may have never heard of this halacha, even though, again, it is explicitly included in Shulchan Aruch. Quite fascinating. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, Ameimar shachav le'bar birei, Ameimar's grandson passed away. So Ameimar's son's son passed away. Kare iluye, he tore kriya for him. Ameimar tore kriya for his grandson. Now I will say, the idea being, it seems that what Ameimar is driving at over here is that Allah Lamaisa, let's see, he tore kriya for his grandson. Asa Berei, then Ameimar's son came. So apparently Ameimar tore kriya for his grandson, not in the presence of his son, who is the direct mourner. His son then came, Kara Ba'ape. Ameimar then tore a second time in the presence of his son. Idkar Demiyushav Kara, he then realized that when he tore kriya, he had torn kriya sitting down. Therefore, what did he do? Kam Kara Mu'umad. He stood up and he tore kriya a third time. So he tore kriya again, but say ultimately again because he tore kriya sitting down and he felt that the obligation to tear kriya was standing up. So the Gemara says, kriya dema'uban binalan. How do you know that kriya has to be torn standing up? Right? Where do we? So we'll say there's a number of intriguing things about this because remember, even though we just got finished saying that when you are in the presence of a direct relative who is mourning, you're obligated to observe mourning practices. Bipashtos, that's more passive mourning practices, like sitting on a low chair, taking off your shoes. Nowhere do we see that there's an obligation of kriya, right? We do not see that. Ameimar tore kriya for his grandson. Son came along, presence of his son, tore kriya second time. But then tore kriya a third time upon realizing that he had torn kriya sitting and not standing. So from where do you know that kriya has to be done standing up? The Kasev, the Chsev, Vayakam, Eov, Vayikra Esmi Ilo. Eov stood up, Vayakam, he stood up, and he tore his meal, he tore his coat. So from here you see Eov tore, right, the Pasuk Davka says Vayakam, he got up. Top of Chaf Aleph, Elamiata, Va'amad Va'amar Lo Chafatzti Lekachta, Hachanami. So we'll say, okay, so then what about the following Pasuk? This is by Chalitza. So in the process of chalitza, the guy doing chalitza says, Va'amar, he stands up, Va'amar, and he says, I do not want to marry her, right? I do not want to marry her. I do not want to do yibum. I want to do chalitza. Hachinami. So since the pasuk says Va'amar, are we going to say now that's what? That Allah Lamaisa, chalitza has to be done standing up. Va'atanya, we learned, Bein Yoshev, Bein Omeid, Bein Muta, whether the cholis, whether the brother is sitting, standing, hunched over, right? It's fine. In other words, chalitza doesn't require a particular position. You can do chalitza however you want to do chalitza. So we'll see from there that just because the Torah says va'amad doesn't mean what? That it requires amida. So why don't you say something over here? Just because it says vayakam Eov is not a raya that chalitza has to be done standing up. Amarle hasam lo ksiv vayamod. Sibbo said there's a difference between saying amad and vayamod, right? Vayamod is an instructive verb. Right, vayamod, and you will get up. Vayakam, and he got up. So this is a premeditated action, as opposed to va'amad, which is really just an expression. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, Amalei hasam lo ksiv vayamod vayomer hacha ksiv vayakam vayikra. So we'll say the Gemara's understanding over here that vayakam is an instructive verb. Is that the Navi is telling us that Eov intentionally got up before he went ahead and did Kriya, telling us that Kriya has to be done standing up. Amarai Bar Chama, Minay Kishimu Umad. Shar Bar Chama says, from where do we know that Kriya has to be done standing up? So the Gemara says, Shne'emar Vayakam Eov Vayikra. Ultimately, again, the pasuk says, Eov got up, and he went ahead and he tore Kriya. I Dilma Milsa Yisra, so David. But maybe not. In other words, maybe Eov was just going above and beyond. Maybe you could do Kriya sitting, standing, do Kriya however you want. But Eov just did something extra. Di'ilo temahachi, because also remember, again, we do see certain excessive practices by Eov. For example, so the Gemara says, Di'ilo temahachi, vayagaz es rosho. The pasuk says Eov tore his hair out. He tore out hair as a sign of mourning. So the Gemara says, Hachanami. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, remember, that's excessive. That's certainly not part of normative mourning practices. So maybe the same way that Eov tore out hair, he also stood up. But standing up is not per se part of the actual halacha of Kriya. The Gemara says, okay, you know what? Maybe we can't learn it out from Eov. Let's learn it out from elsewhere. Vayakam hamelech vayikra es begadav. King David HaMelech stood up and he tore his clothing. This is when he thought that Avshalom had killed Amnon, but he thought that Avshalom had killed more of his children. David HaMelech got up and he tore his clothing. Maybe David went above and beyond. In other words, maybe getting up and tearing Kriya was an excessive form of mourning. In other words, but it's not the obligatory level of mourning. The pasuk says, David HaMelech laid down on the floor. He laid down on the floor. So the Gemara says, Hachanami v'tanyo, Yoshav agabi mita, agabi kisi, agabi udayni gedola, agabi karka, mikulan lo yotze de chavaso. Yet we learned that in Avelos as a concept of Kfiyah Samita. And what does Kfiyah Samita require? Kfiyah Samita literally requires the overturning of the bed. So for example, if the Avel goes ahead and sits on a bed, or on a chair, or on udayni, Daini literally again is like a mortar, right? Daini Gidola, or on the ground, you're not Yotze. You're not Yotze. In other words, you need Kviya Samita. And yet we see that David HaMelech laid down on the ground. V'amar Rabbi Yochanan shelo kiyem Kviya Samita. It means that when the pasuk says David HaMelech laid down on the ground, it doesn't literally mean on the ground, it means like on the ground. What does it mean to lay down like on the ground? Overturning the bed. So it turns out that we have two sources, possible sources, for the fact that Kriya has to be done standing up. Either from Eov, Vayakam Eov, or from David HaMelech, Vayakam HaMelech Vayikra. And both say this is indeed halacha l'maisa. Kriya has to be done ba'amida. Kriya has to be done standing up. Tan Rabbanon, this is how Shulchan Aruch paskins. Ve'elu dvarim she'aval aser bahen. Both say these are things that an aval is not allowed to do. Things that an aval is not allowed to do. So the Gemara says, aser b'malacha, he's not allowed to work. Berechitza, bathing, sicha, anointing, tashmish shamita, relations, nilas hasandal, wearing shoes. Va'aser likros batorah. Brothers say furthermore, again, this is something we have not discussed before. An aval is not permitted to learn. Not permitted. Aser likros batorah. B'neviim u'b'ksuvim. He can't learn Chumash. He can't learn Navi. He can't learn Ksuvim. V'lishnos b'mishnah, b'medrash, b'halachos, b'ashas, u'ba'agados. Ultimately, in Bosei halacha l'maisa, he's not allowed to learn anything. He's not allowed to learn anything. Now, Bosei, what I will point out is something very interesting. If you look at Tosas very, very quickly, if you look at Tosas v'aser, which is the first wide line in Tosas, v'aser kros b'torah b'shulas rabbeinu Yitzchak zekeni kasav ki rabbeinu Yaakov haya osher me'evlo b'iyov u'b'kines u'b'dvarim haram shir b'yirmiyah. They're both saying, here's what's interesting. If you notice, by the way, right, when we learned in Maseches Tainis about Tisha B'Av, we learned also Tisha B'Av also has an Isser Talmud Torah, right? But yet the Gemara there said, what can you learn on Tisha B'Av? What can you learn? So we call Dvarim Ra'im, right? Things that have a connection to Avelos. So for example, you could learn Moed Katan, because Moed Katan goes through the halachas of Avelos. You could learn the story of the Churban in Meseches Gittin. You could learn Yirmiyahu Hanavi, right? Because again, prophet of destruction. You could do Kinnis. If you notice, by the way, over here, the Gemara doesn't quote that exception. So Tosas quotes over here in the name of Rabbeinu Yitzchak, who says that during Shiva, you can't learn anything. You can't learn anything, even Dvarim Ra'im. Tosas disagrees with that and says, no, effectively, Shiva is going to be the same thing as Tisha B'Av. And whatever you can learn on Tisha B'Av, you can learn during Shiva. Right? So again, Dvarim Ra'im would be permitted during Shiva as well. So you could learn Torah during Shiva. It just has to be learning that somehow has a morning motif. Of course, you could learn Hilchos Avelos. You could learn these sugyas in Moed Katan. You can go ahead and learn Kinnis and learn Eov and learn all of the things that are connected to Churban. Just pointing it out. But say back to the Gemara. This is an incredible Gemara. Let's say the person sitting Shiva is someone whom the public needs. Tell me who the public needs. Person sitting Shiva as a Rav, is a posek, is someone who, a Rebbe, someone who the public needs. They need, Rashi points over here, Lidrasha. Now, Lidrasha doesn't mean that literally they need you to give a drasha. Right? Lidrasha means over here, they need you for your halachic rulings. Right? What if the Avel is someone whom the community depends upon? So what's the halacha? Eino nimna. You could continue to paskin halacha and discuss matters of dinei Torah and adjudicate situations even during Shiva, which I will say is such a profound halacha. Because what is the halacha essentially saying? See, when a person is in Shiva Rabosai and Rabbim Tzrichim, the public needs him, there's a tension. What's the tension? Between what I need as an individual and what the community needs from me. And so again, the Gemara telling us that when there is a conflict between individual needs and communal needs, who wins? Communal needs. Right? The community always wins out over the individual. The needs of the collective always trump the needs of the individual. An incredible yisod. We'll say, even think about it again, about what it means to be part of community, and what it means to be part of Klal Yisrael. Very often, there's a conflict between the needs of the individual versus the needs of the collective, whatever that collective may be, a shul, a community, a kehillah, a klal. And again, when those conflicts happen, which are inevitable, Chazal always sensitize us to that the needs of the many, the needs of the collective, the needs of the kehillah, always outweighs the needs of the yachid. And here there's a dramatic example of this. The person is sitting shiva. Leave the guy alone. No, if the community needs him, then ultimately, again, he sets aside his own issues and is there for the community. So incredible. Listen to this story. One time, the son of Rabbi Yossi of Tzipori passed away. V'nichnas lebeis hamedrash. Nevertheless, even during Shiva, he came into the beis medrash. V'darash kalei kulo, and he gave shir the entire day. He gave shir the entire day. And I both say, now obviously, when it says shir, what it must be talking about something that was time sensitive, that was needed for right then. Well, so I'll just point out to you how incredible is a Gemara like that. It also shows you the incredible strength we possess. Here, Rabbi Yossi lost a child. I think the most painful loss that a person could ever endure in this world. And yet, what does he do? He finds a way to compartmentalize his loss and get the job done for the rabbin. Get the job done, which I will say, Shul gives us a window into the incredible strength that we have when people suffer loss, especially tragic. Every loss is tragic in its own way, but some loss is even more overwhelmingly tragic. So people allowed their loss to sideline them, right? They allowed the loss that that's it. I can't move on. And then you see a Gemara like this, and you see, yes, you can. You do what you have to do to move yourself forward. Here, Rabbi Yossi is sitting Shiva for his child, but they need him in the beis medrash. So sometimes we'll say what life requires of us is to gather in our grief, compartmentalize that grief for a little bit of time, and do what has to be done. I guarantee you, when the shir was over, he went back and was overwhelmed by his grief, because that's the nature of grief. But life is all about not allowing difficult situations to paralyze you. Compartmentalize it, do what has to get done, and move forward. It's incredible. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Bar Chana Israeli Milsa. Rabbi Bar Chana also suffered a loss. And what happened? He assumed that he could not give shir. Rabbi Chanina said to him, Rabbi, we learned that if the rabbin need you, you have to go to the beis medrash. Yeah, Amrle. So the Gemara says, so okay, so he went to the beis medrash, and he was going to set up his amora. Also, remember again, the amora is the turgaman, right? That's the person who, the Rabbi says something, and then the amora goes ahead and distills it into digestible piece of information for the masses. Amrle Rav, Tanyo Bilvachal Yami Turgaman. No, that you can't do. That you can't do. In other words, that when the person is in Avelos and still teaching Torah, you could do that, but you have to employ almost like some type of shinui, right? Some type of change. And the change we talk about is no Torgaman. Ve'ela hechi of it. So what should you do? So the Gemara says, one time the son of Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi died. We'll say it's also very dramatic. I don't know why this is. That if you notice, by the way, all of these cases are with the loss of children, which is really. I mean, again, it could have to be just with infant mortality in the times of the Gemara, but again, it is striking that all of these examples of these great Rabbanim are all with the loss of children. It's very, very overwhelming. Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi lost a child, and he went to the beis medrash. V'nichnas Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya v'yashev b'tzil. That was the first wide line. Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya went in behind Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi, and he sat down next to Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi. V'lachash hu Rabbi Chananya bar Akavya. Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya l'torgaman. V'torgaman ishmil l'rab. So we'll say what happened. Rabbi Yehuda Bar Eloi whispered the ruling to Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya. Rabbi Chananya ben Akavya whispered to the Torgaman, and then the Torgaman taught it to everyone else. was a long day. It was a long day. And they will say, but the idea is, so interesting enough what the Gemara is saying over here is, if Rabbim Srichim Lo, if the community needs the particular individual sitting Shiva, he can go and he can go into the Beis Midrash, he can even deliver Shir, but he has to employ some type of Shinu. It has to be Mishana. There has to be some type of deviation from the Ram. Tan Rabbanon, Avel Gimel Yom HaRishon, Asal Aniach Tefillin. We'll see an interesting machlokes here. Bryce says an Avel, for the first 3 days, doesn't put on tefillin. Mishlishi ve'elech, from the third day and on, ushlishi bichlal, and the third day is included with this, which really means from day number 3 and on, so mutter la'aniach tefillin. You could begin to put on tefillin. So really, according to this first opinion, the Avel is not putting on tefillin for the first 2 days. Right? From the third day and on, he's beginning to put on tefillin. V'imbo panim chadashos, and even if new people come to visit him on day number 3, Eino cholet, he does not remove his tefillin in their presence. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yeshua Omer. That's what we'll say. Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar, Avel doesn't put. We call it Avel doesn't put on tefillin 3 days, but really what it means is Avel doesn't put on tefillin for for the first 2 days. On day number 3, he begins to put on tefillin. Rabbi Yeshua says no. Avel beizam harishalim asal aniach tefillin. An Avel doesn't put on tefillin for the first 2 days, but really what that means is misheni bechal motel aniach tefillin. But from day number 2, you can begin to put on tefillin, which really means what? An Avel doesn't put on tefillin for how long? 1 day. 1 day. So we'll say machlokas. Rabbi Elazar says Avel doesn't put on tefillin for 2 days. Rabbi Yeshua Avel doesn't put on tefillin for 1 day. But according to Rabbi Yoshua, if new people show up to be menachim Aval from day 2 and on, choletz, he takes off his tefillin in the presence of the new people who come. Amr Rav Masna. Rav Masna says, my time with Rabbi Elazar. What's Rabbi Elazar's logic that an Aval doesn't put on tefillin for 2 days? Where do you get 2 days from? D'chsiv vaytamu yimei b'chi evel Moshe. I will say the pasuk says, and the days of mourning, vayitmu, yimei b'chi evel Moshe. The days of mourning for Moshe conclude. I will say now the minimum number of days is 2. So from here you see that the intense mourning lasts for 2 days, and therefore Allah Aval doesn't put on tefillin for 2 days. I will say now I want to point out the fact that an Aval doesn't put on tefillin. We already learned that from who? From who? Right? Remember again. That was from Yecheskel, right? We already saw that earlier on, right? When the Akash Baruch Hu tells the Navi that his wife is going to die, and he tells him, Pe'ercha chavush alecha, keep your tefillin on. So from there we already see that an Avel doesn't wear tefillin. What we don't know is for how long. So Elazar says, the pasuk says they mourned for Moshe, plural 2 days. From here you see, don't put on tefillin for 2 days, the most intense part of mourning, and ultimately begin to put tefillin on from day number 3 and on. My time, so the Gemara says, Amrav Ina, my time to Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua says, you don't only put on tefillin for 1 day. T'chsev va'acharisa ki yom mar. And its end will be like a bitter day, which indicates that the most intense part of mourning is day number 1. And therefore, Allah Chalamayse, don't put on tefillin for day 1, but put on tefillin from day 2 and on. Rabbi Yoshua nami haksev, vayitmu yimei. Rabbi Yoshua, what do you do with the pasuk that says vayitmu yimei, which seems to indicate that the intense mourning is 2 days? Shiny Moshe to Takivavli. No, you can't bring a raya from Moshe Rabbeinu. Can't bring a raya from Moshe. Yeah, when Moshe Rabbeinu died, the mourning was so intense. But that's not a normative situation. Rabbi Elazar nami haksev v'acharisa kiyomar. Rabbi Elazar, what do you do with the pasuk that says v'acharisa kiyomar, which seems to indicate that intense mourning is for 1 day? So the Gemara says, Ikar marira chad yomahu. He says, yes, I agree. The ikar bitterness of mourning is for 1 day, but the intensity still spills over into day number 2, and therefore no tefillin for day number 2. So we'll say fundamental machlokas, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Elazar is saying you don't put on tefillin for the first 2 days, begin to put on tefillin from day number 3 and on. Rabbi Yoshua is saying you don't put on tefillin for day number 1, but put on tefillin from day number 2 and on, each of them quoting their own psukim. Amr Ula says, Halach Rabbi Elazar. The halacha of Rabbi Elazar that you don't put on tefillin for the first 2 days. Sorry, halacha Rabbi Elazar bechalitza, halacha Rabbi Yoshua behanacha. The halacha of Rabbi Elazar in terms of taking off, which means Rabbi say that what? Once an Avel begins to put on tefillin, he never takes it off. Which Rabbi say means like this. Just to understand the concept of chalitza, of taking off tefillin is like this. One might have thought that once the Avel puts on tefillin, when someone new comes to see the Avel, Rabbi say there's a concept of panim chadashos bayavelos. So the assumption is that when someone who comes to visit the Avel, there's a new wave of intensity, of sadness that sweeps over the morning. I will say, you see this, when a person is sitting Shiva, part of the beauty of Shiva is seeing people that you haven't seen for a long time. But what that does sometimes is the following, that you've seen this. If you've ever been in the Shiva home, or Rahman a person has ever sat Shiva, and someone who you haven't seen in a while comes to see you, it brings in a whole new wave of emotion. So the concept of chalitza says that almost when a person sees someone who they haven't seen for a long time, panim chadashos, maybe the avos should have to take off their tefillin again. Because seeing that person brings me back like to day one of the avelos. It brings a fresh pain. I'm so happy to see this person, but it brings back a new wave of pain along with it as well. So Ula says, which means that once an Avel has the license to begin to put on tefillin, he doesn't take it off even if someone new comes. But the halacha follows Rabbi Yeshua by Hanocha, namely, an Avel doesn't wear tefillin for the first day of his Shiva, but he does wear tefillin subsequently. We'll say that's how you pass in halacha l'maisa. An Avel does not wear tefillin on day one of his Avelos, day one of his Shiva. This is not talking about aninos, right? Aninos, the period between death and burial. That's something different. That an Avel is exempt from all positive mitzvos because osek b'mitzvah patam in a mitzvah. He's actively involved in the mitzvah of taking care of the dead, so he's exempt from all the positive mitzvahs. It's not the first day of Shiva. The first day of Shiva, an Avel does not put on tefillin. But from day 2 and on, he will wear tefillin. Ibaylo, b'sheni le'ula, cholitz or eno cholitz. What about on the second day? What about on the second day when the Avel is wearing tefillin and someone new comes? Does the Avel take off his tefillin or not? So the Gemara says, Tashma amru ula choletz umaniach afilu mea pamim. He takes off and he puts on even 100 times. Tanya mehachi Yehuda ben Tema Omer choletz umaniach afilu mea pamim. Rabba Amar kevan sheiniach shuv eino choletz. Rabba says no. On the other hand, once an Avel has the license to put on tefillin, he doesn't take it off anymore, even if someone new comes. But Rabba said the halacha follows our Tana. The Amar Shlosha Amadeis. Shlosha, that the Avel said, that the Avel doesn't put on tefillin for the first 3 days, to which the Gemara says, mitzvah shiny. A mitzvah is different. Which I was saying, or I should say differently, that in Avel, the first 3 days of mourning are most intense. Mitzvah is different. Mitzvah, Tab Rashi Amud Beis, Kilomar Hoyel Mitzvah Laniach Tefillin Matzi Laniach La'alter B'Sheni. But even though again the Avelos might be most stringent and most intense for the first 3 days, and therefore during the first 3 days, as we will discuss, there are certain things you can't do. Tefillin is different. Since Tefillin is a mitzvah, Shavuot says, so the Avel won't wear Tefillin on day one. Now remember again, why don't I wear Tefillin on day one? That's based on the Navi. That's Pe'ercha Chavu Shalecha. That ultimately, again, tefillin is called the crown. The Avel shouldn't wear a crown on the first day of his Avelos. Therefore, the Avel does not wear tefillin on day 1 of Shiva. But after day 1, he goes ahead and he puts on tefillin. And even if halacha l'maisa, someone new comes, he does not go ahead and remove the tefillin. Incredible. Let's see, here we go. Here's the discussion about the 3 days. So here we go. Avel Gimel Yamim Harishanim Asr B'Malacha. We'll say now the first 3 days. Also, you should just know we're going to discuss this in depth. It is fascinating to see that Chazal looked at the first 3 days of Shiva in a different light. Those are the most intense days of mourning. In fact, there's an opinion we will see in the Shulchan Aruch that says one should not be menachem Avel in the first 3 days. One should not go to visit a mourner in the first 3 days. Again, we'll discuss contemporarily what we do with this. But halacha l'maisa, again, this is recognized in the first 3 days. Gimel Yom Rishonim Asr B'Malacha. The Avel can't do any work. Even if you're poor and supported from tzedakah, you still can't do any work. Mikan ve'ilach, after the first 3 days, if a person needs to do work, so he could do work privately inside of his house. Va'isha Tava b'pelach b'soch beis. And a woman could spin her thread, again, inside of her house, also privately. Tan Rabbanon, Avel Gim Yom Harishonim. So I'll say we begin to see this motif that the first 3 days of mourning are treated more stringently than the rest of Avelos. So similarly, Tan Rabbanon, Avel Gim Yom Harishonim, and Avel, during the first 3 days, Eino Holich Lebeis Ha'Avel. So I'll say this is a fascinating situation. What is an Avel permitted to go and comfort other mourners? The Rebbe said this could happen in a variety of ways. I'll tell you, just Rahman al just where we saw this not so long ago. We'll say you saw examples of this in the aftermath of the Meron tragedy, right? You saw families who were connected by this horrific tragedy. We're going to be menachem aval to each other. So how does it work? If someone is in Shiva, but they want to go be menachem aval someone else? We'll say, so in general, we would say that an aval does not go to do nichum avelim by someone else. But let's say again, it's an extenuating circumstance, and the aval feels compelled to go. So gimel yom harishon eino holech lebeis aval. So first of all, in the first 3 days of avelos, an aval doesn't leave his home. Right, because the first 3 days of Shiva are considered to be the most intense. Aval doesn't go anywhere. Mikan ve'ilach, but if after the first 3 days the aval needs to be menachem aval by someone else, holech ve'in yoshe makom hamanachim elav makom hamisnachim. The aval could go, but interestingly enough, when the aval goes to another Shiva home, he doesn't sit with the comforters, but rather he sits with the mourners. So when an avel goes to visit an avel, 2 people in Shiva, and one person goes to visit another person, he doesn't sit, opposite the mourners, like where the menachem, where the comforters go to sit, but rather he sits with the avelim. Tan Rabbanan, avel gimul yom harishonim asur b'sheila shalom. But saying avel, in the first 3 days of his Shiva, is not permitted to greet anyone. Mishlosha v'at Shiva mei Shiva v'yeno shoel. I will say from the 3rd day until the end of Shiva, if somebody greets the avel could respond, but the avel does not initiate a greeting with someone else. Mikan ve'ilach, but from there on in, right? Mikan ve'ilach, shoel u'meishiv kidarko. After Shiva, an avel could go ahead and greet people, could inquire, right? Could initiate a greeting, could respond to a greeting in a normal way. Shlosh yom harishonim. So is that true? That for the first 3 days, so I'll say, the way the Gemara broke this up was as follows. During the first 3 days of Shiva, an avel cannot extend any kind of greeting, right? You can't greet him, he can't respond, he can't initiate. From the 3rd day of Shiva to the end of Shiva, avel can't initiate, but what can he do? He could respond. After Shiva, he could respond, he could initiate, not a problem. So the Gemara says, so is that true, Tanya? This is an incredible story. Masa umesu banav shel Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva's sons died. Now, the truth is, it seems to be, it's not sons, but rather it's son singular. Rabbi Akiva lost a child. Nichnisu kol Yisrael b'hispidum hesped gadol. All of Klal Yisrael came, and they delivered, right? It was a massive levaya, and there was a massive eulogy. But listen to this story. B'shas piti rasan, as everybody was leaving the levaya, Amad Rabbi Akiva al safsal gadol. Rabbi Akiva went ahead and stood up on a large bench. Va'amar, achinu beis Yisrael, my brothers, Shemu, listen to me. Afilu shnei banim chasanim, even if had I buried 2 married sons with families of their own, minucham hu. I am consoled because of the great thing that you have done. I will say, this is Rabbi Akiva speaking at his son's levaya, telling the people who have come, thank you so much for coming. The fact that you all came, I am consoled by your presence. And if you came because of me, just because of Akiva, harikama Akiva bashuk. There are so many Akivas in the marketplace. Elakach amartem. Torah's elokav belibo. You didn't come for me, but you came for my Torah. You came for the Torah that I represent, that my son represents. The kol shekin shescharchem kafel. And all the more so because you came, not out of a personal responsibility, but out of kavod Torah, that your reward ultimately again for coming is doubled. I just want to point out something amazing. Rabbi Akiva over here is doing what is one of the most incredible things, which is, as a mourner, not to focus on one's personal loss, but to focus on the other. You see, grief, by definition, is an all-consuming emotion. When a person grieves, grief could swallow you up. What Rabbi Akiva is doing over here is he's putting his personal grief on the side, and he's focusing, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. Part of what these Gemaras teach us is the ability to control our emotions. We often think that the way we feel is not something we can control. And that's true, but yet false. It's true that how you feel initially, you often can't control. Right? If I feel sad, I can't control that initial feeling of grief. What I can control is the grip my emotions have on me. That's where the intellect has to go ahead and take over emotion. I have the ability to regulate. I have the ability to control how my emotions impact me. That's what these Gemaras teach us. So when you saw the Rabbanim on Amud Aleph who are going to give shir, even though they're sitting shiva for their children, that's because I can't control feeling sad, but I can control how I allow that sadness to impact me. I can regulate emotion. This is, although in general I'm a strong proponent for allowing emotion to reign over intellect, there are times when intellect has to keep emotion in check. So Rabbi Akiva, at the end of the Levaya for his son, is getting up there and thanking the people. Thank you for coming. And thank you for coming because you're coming out Kavod Torah. And your reward is incredible. L'chu levatechem l'shalom. Go home in peace. Now both say, L'chu levatechem l'shalom is a greeting. So here Rabbi Akiva is greeting everyone at the Levaya. We just said before that for the first 3 days you can't extend any greeting. To which the Gemara says, Kavod Rabim Shayni. No. Kavod you give to the public. Kavod Rabim is different, I will say. When we say that from days 1 through 3, you can't extend any greeting, respond to any greeting, that's about individuals. But ultimately, again, else the Rabbim, whenever it has to do with the Rabbim, ultimately, again, the Rabbim always have a different halacha, and therefore Rabbi Akiva was able to give a bracha, a departing bracha, to the Rabbim as well. We'll say, all right, we'll have to stop over here. We'll pick up in the middle of our days tomorrow. Shkoyach. All right, Chavran Zimmer, have a wonderful day. A good Chodesh, everyone.